Well, hello and welcome to this, the ninth lesson within the cycle of 18 that make up the full program of lessons in this course. We are looking today at the first of two lessons that will cover ASP pages and how Sage CRM can be extended using the ASP COM API. Now, this is the original API that was used to allow developers to be able to extend the functionality of Sage CRM. It's since been adapted and extended still itself further by APIs such as the .NET API and the RESTful web services. But here we're going to be looking at something that is really quite fundamental because it will look as well at the techniques that we can use for the creation of all sorts of scripts inside the product itself. So although we're looking here at ASP pages, much of what we're talking about is how Sage CRM uses the COM API to be able to interact with the database with its own engine to be able to do the work. So we introduce this here within the cycle because when we come on to looking at the use of the internal scripting inside the component manager and within the advanced mail manager, we will already be building on the work that we have done earlier within the understanding of scripting inside workflow and its scripting inside the table level scripts that we've seen in the earlier part of the training. So today we are going to take a fairly high level view of how the API objects work inside the ASP framework. We're going to look at the way in which we can connect to external database sources. We can start to think about how we extend to third-party databases and how we can add new entities inside the system. Now, all this is going to be high level. So I'm going to be thinking about getting you to think about the conceptual nature of what's going on, how an ASP page fits inside the user interface, and how we then are able to call the user interface or that extension of the interface, and what information is passed, and what then do our ASP pages have to contain in order to be valid. And that's to manage the whole idea of the session and then the security, etc. So we'll be looking at that and look at two specific ways in which data is handled inside an ASP page, looking at the listing of data and then the editing of data. That'll set the scene for our next lesson next week, which will be looking at a little bit more interesting things around ASP pages, using the insertion and deletion of data, and thinking about the way in which we can use ASP pages in other structures such as workflow as well. Now, before we go on anywhere, the point of keep me saying it's a high level training course is to remind you that, of course, I'm only pointing you at what can be done and the general idea of what can be done. Where you will find out the specifics of the references for the ASP API is going to be within the documentation. So you need to be aware that the fact that our help center has got all of the references that you need to be able to start to get to grips with this API. Now, I know we've talked about how some API information is found on developer.sage.com, but here all of the Sage CRM ASP API information is found within the references inside the standard documentation, developer documentation on specifically help.sagecrm.com. and you can open and explore this information. What you need to specifically look for is within help crm.com, looking at the version of Sage CRM you're using, the developer notes, and then down into the ASP objects. Now, this is not where you would necessarily learn how to actually construct an ASP page. That's really going to be where you need the lessons and you need the other forms of documentation, because here you can look at the nitty-gritty of the individual elements, the objects, if you like, and see all of the referencing points here. But I think that you will find most information on the usage of this actually away from the documentation, which tells you the details of what each method, which property is, but you need to step back a little bit and look at the resources that are on the video channel. Now, obviously, there is an irony in this, in that I'm adding another video that talks about the video channel. The video channel contains a set of resources that look at how to create a list page, how to create an edit page. So there are individual short lessons that will look specifically at the usage of the API in those contexts. And we'll also be coming on to the fact that the community, this is the Sage community hub, also contains a lot of information about the way in which ASP pages are constructed. And I would refer you to this article, which is a roundup of articles about creating ASP pages. You should be able to Google that, find it. I would then bookmark it so that you have reference to it when you want to be able to learn how to do something, because it does go in through a range of different topics, showing you exemplar pages on how for example, you can create a search page, how you can create a list page, how you can create and handle the deletion of data or the insertion of data as well. It also looks at sort of fairly esoteric things in this as well. So if you were thinking about how you would add in and extend the functionality of workflow, for example, you have the option of either doing that through ASP Pages or the .NET DLL, and it's sometimes easier to do things in the ASP Pages because it's a quick and easy hack into quickly writing into text files. Now, having said that, we do have some other information that you need to know about, and I'm going to send you off to a different location as well for this. This is looking at the idea of the SDK installer. A lot of the examples that I will show you have been written using resources that either automate or semi-automate the creation of ASP pages. This is the idea of using something that will have snippets. Now, the SDK really comes into its own. This is primarily for the .NET API, but along with all of the SDK installer, along with the templates needed to be able to create the basic template class and the specialized classes for the .NET API, which we will be meeting at the end of the training, that the SDK installer will install a set of JavaScript libraries for use with ASP pages, for use with the email manager, etc. So it even includes client-side API examples as well within the snippet library. So it's a very useful tool to be able to download, and it was updated for 2023 R1 and supports for 2023 R2 onwards as well. Now, if we explore what that actually will do for us, here you can see that I'm working with a page that I've started to write, and you'll notice that there is a page of JavaScript being written, and I can there see that I've right mouse clicked and gone in to go and look for a snippet that can be included. Now, that overall page wrapper was written using one snippet, and then I can start to assemble the bits within the page using the snippet as well. It doesn't have perfect IntelliSense, but the more you use it, the more familiar it becomes with the particular classes that you will have used and or the particular objects that you've used, and start to help you with that. It is a very good tool to allow us to be able to familiarize ourselves with the .NET, with the JavaScript of the ASP COM API. You'll find that, certainly I find after a while, I just write it, and because I've started to know what it is. There is also another resource if you fancy using a old-fashioned text editor like TextPad, if you're hardcore, and I'm afraid a lot of the work that I do, I just use a text editor like this because, again, it offers the ability to use snippets, and this TextPad has a very good set of syntaxing and snippets to allow you to, again, create the outline of the page that you want, and then find the appropriate snippet that you want to drop into the code so you can start to assemble an ASP page, a bit like Lego can be used to build a new structure inside the system. Now, that's all things for you to play with. If we start, though, to narrow down and look at what's going on inside a page, we can start to see how things are built. And I'm going to start by moving away from using TextPad as an example of writing, and I'm going to go into looking at how it's written using Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, because Visual Studio typically, unless you get a particular add-on that supports the idea of ASP pages, and ASP pages in specifically that are using JavaScript as their language, you will probably not find, you won't be able to write in a single way, as in a single file. You can within something like a inside the TextPad text editor, but I find it easier to say, well, I'm going to write my HTML wrapper page and then write my code page deliberately as JavaScript. And this is something that it becomes very, very useful to do using Visual Studio. My version of Visual Studio happens to be 2022. But if I look here at what we've got on the slide in front of us, on the left-hand side, I've written an ASP page. Now, ASP pages are an example of making use of a type of file that is then parsed and read by the IIS, the web server, to automatically trigger the extension that should process this. And so when you install Sage CRM, it has to have the ASP extensions for IIS installed. So ASP pages will be read, and they will then load that ASP page and process it using the correct filter for ASP pages. The ASP pages will act then through to call and invoke the scripting engine. By default, ASP pages wants to use VB script, but we generally write our ASP pages in JavaScript. It is possible to do it in VBScript, but I don't think that you'll have very many people who are familiar with VBScript. You're more likely to find JavaScript coders, and it's not difficult JavaScript that we're talking about here. If we look at what the file is doing, is it's loading in, this is the left-hand file, the wrapper file is loading in two libraries. The first is the Sage CRM.js file, which is the initialization file that will set the language and handle the creation of the CRM objects. These are the COM objects that are available through the registration of the classes within the eWare DLL that form the API. So when we will look in a moment at details of what's going on inside Sage CRM.js and calling then, as it does, Sage CRM nolang.js, we'll see what it's doing. Our include file of the HTML page code.js file is whatever file you've wanted to write. So this is the business file that will contain the code that you're interested in. And that's what you can see here on the right hand side. I've been a bit more fiddly than I would normally be. So here you can see that I'm using a structure for try and catch. And yes, here you can see that I am using variables like var rather than more modern style of writing JavaScript with let and const. This is vars in browser JavaScript is deprecated, but within the scripting engine that ASP Pages use, that's still the type of variable declaration that we're using. And that's to do with the scripting engine rather than anything else. So if I look at where those files are stored, you can see that there is a folder underneath the installation of Sage CRM called www.root custom pages. So my instance of Sage CRM is CRM, and the path is down underneath program files, Sage CRM, with the instance of CRM with www.root and then custom pages. And custom pages can be then have a set of folders within them to allow you to break up the different projects that you're working on to segregate the code so that there's no confusion as to what page is doing what. So typical segregation would be around one folder or subfolder would be for a custom entity or for a new table that has been defined within inside the system. In my case, I was a bit lazy. I put them straight down into that custom pages root folder of where you can see the HTML page.asp and the HTML page code.js file. As we go through, these SDK snippets start to allow us to build our page. And if we zoom in on what's going on, it's where we start to assemble the structure of whether this is a list page or whether this is an edit page or whether this is carrying out a search. We can use the particular pages to use the particular snippets to do the particular coding job that we want. In terms of coding within an ASP page, one of the first questions that I would use, I would typify these as, I call them the Saturday morning questions of who am I and where am I? And those are the things that the initial pages, initial lines of the code are always attempting to answer. The who am I is Sage CRM, and that's going to be handled by the library that we'll look at in a moment. And the where am I is the idea of grabbing the context of the current page so it can then make the correct call. And that who am I is not only the where you are in the flow of pages, and that's another concept that I'll come up with in a moment, but it's the who is the user and what company you're looking at, what person you're looking at, what is the overall general context. So those snippets allow you to build the information that you need. But the first set of questions about what am I, where am I, are answered really by the include file that we saw here. This is the file on the left-hand side where we can see that there's a reference to, on the left screen, the idea of Sage CRM.js. Now there are different files that if you're working with a machine that has been upgraded for a long time, you may or may not see different types of include file available to you. So for example, the Sage CRM.js file is the JavaScript page that is used for ASP Pages. That starts everything, but its job is to set the language to be used, to be JavaScript, and then make a subsequent call to another file called Sage CRM nolang.js file that is included, that will then create the internal object. Now that's something that I do want to talk about a little bit more so that you understand what the importance of that file is in answering those Saturday morning questions. The Sage CRM.vbs file that you might find is only ever used in the context of where VBScript is used, and frankly that's not used anymore, and you probably won't see, unless you are working with a very old upgraded system, you won't see a reference to a file called ASP CRM. It used to be called ASP CRM as the include files. Another type of files for the include job are created automatically by the advanced customization wizard, and I will touch on the wizard in this lesson a little bit, and more in next week's lesson as well, so the following lesson. Here you have these files. They have the very basic job of declaring the language, but then once the language of JavaScript has been set, Sage CRM .js will call and include Sage CRM nolang.js file. You can see that then is declaring the COM object that we're going to be using. So where you see it using a server.create object to create the object that we will refer to as CRM, in this you'll notice that it is being passed, as part of its initialization, information that has come from the ASP page. Now that contains all of the form objects and request objects that you would expect as part of the CGI variables, the Common Gateway Interface variables that arrive on the web server as the browser, the HTTP user agent, has requested that. And so you can see that you get everything passed into the initialization of the COM object. It needs to know everything that's in the URL that's called it, so the full system variables it has access to, anything that might have been submitted as a result of a form, anything to work out whether it is HTTPS within a secure context, and information such as these are the server name and the HTTP user agent are CGI variables announcing who the request has come from. These are all used to work out whether the license is valid and whether the user has a valid session as well, because it's reading that and working out whether in fact the credentials provided and the session provided are true. So that is the point in which any of the information is incorrect, you're likely to get a 500 error. So you're very likely to get a HTTP error, so announcing that there's a server problem if, for example, you've invoked a page and you haven't included the correct SID or session ID at the top. This means that you can't write Sage CRM ASP pages and expect to use them outside of the scope of the user interface. That's not true for the way in which self-service pages work. Self-service pages don't have the same type of initialization for the version of the object that is used in self-service ASP pages, but I will discuss that at the appropriate lesson. Let's remind ourselves of what's going on here inside the architecture. Now, I talked about the ASP pages having to be passed information from the browser. So we will have our browser in which we are working in the context of the main CRM interface. Our ASP pages will have assumed that we've logged on, and that will assume that we have got all of the session information from the eWare DLL. When we call an ASP page, because the ASP page is obviously a different resource on the server than the eWare DLL, when we call the ASP page, we are going to find that we're relying on the variables that we've passed to be given to the COM object as it's instantiated to allow it to then pass those with the server registration of the COM object into the behavior of the system. So it is the server instantiation of the eWare DLL within the context of the ASP page, which is then making the calls to the database to fetch the data that we need and to do the other data tasks that we're doing. So we call an ASP address, it gets routed through to the ASP page. It itself is using then the COM object to access the eWare DLL registered DLL and the libraries within that to be able to then carry out the task. In essence, we have to make sure that our URL contains all of the information that we need so that the Saturday morning questions of who am I, where am I, can be answered adequately. So the who am I is the SID information, the where am I is the context information, and that all has to be passed in, as you can see, as you're calling a page like the quotes list page. So that quotes list page has all of that information. It's got all of the name value pairs that you would expect in the main user interface to allow it to then draw the page that we want. That process of drawing the page rests on what the code inside the ASP page is doing. If you think back to our earlier lessons, when we talked about the importance of metadata and how metadata is used to draw the screens. We use metadata in the same way inside the ASP pages. So the ASP pages are all about saying, I want to use a list, and the list derives its definitions from the custom_screen objects metadata table that is associated with the custom_views table as the view that provides the information into the list. The data source is defined within custom_tables, and if we were wanting to access information from an external database, that would have to have been held inside custom_databases. So all of that hierarchy of information provides us with the ability to create a complex screen inside CRM with perhaps only 4 lines of code. So what context am I in? Grab the list definition, write a variable to restrict the context, restrict the data returned to the context, and then send everything to the browser. So you're looking at a way of using metadata to write very short bits of code that will create a full-featured interface. It's a very elegant thing. Now, you can, as the previous page was looking at in the presentation, this is something that you can use ASP Pages to either call existing structures inside the database, so new structures that are existing, or you can create new structures inside the database, or you can extend the data model so you are looking into a third-party database. So you can certainly call up information from another database, like whether it is Sage 100, Sage 300, Sage X3, wherever you can create a database connection to, you can call that across. And if you want to know how to do something, one of the and this is an advert for a new feature inside the Sage Help Center, is that you can actually start to ask, how do I do something? And the document, and you can find out here, for example, like, how can I make a connection to an external database? And the Sage CRM Ally will actually provide you with the data that you need. It will allow you to get a sense of narrowing it down to a particular version as well of the documentation that you need to reference. So that's how we can grab and use the Help Center to be able to help us write the pages that we need. But let's look at the question of what if we wanted to create a brand new table within inside the system? What do we have to consider? Now, when we create a new table or a new entity inside the system, we have to think about how we are going to create the supporting metadata. That's the metadata to allow for the table to be created in the first place, or the metadata to allow the connection to be established, how the fields within that table are described, how we will then build any lists that any views that interrogate that data, and how we might also then build lists and screens based on the fields and the table contained there. So this is all things that we have to work through. And when we come on to creating our own tables, we could do this externally from Sage CRM, but it's much easier to use the features inside Sage CRM. So you actually would go into the advanced customization area and create a new table or database connection and create a new table inside CRM. You can then add further columns to that table to build it out. Now, the reason I talk about the importance of that is that there are some fields inside, say, inside the tables that we would need to define if they were to be managed correctly by Sage CRM that we have to include. So it obviously has to have a primary key that is correctly managed as being an identity column that is then ensured is always populated, but we also need to contain fields that indicate how a user is managing that table. So we would have who created it, who updated it, when did they create it, when was it updated. So we're a whole set of things. And if this is a primary entity to be governed by security and workflow, we would have to have the supporting columns for that as well. And we would also have to add in the foreign key references that explain how this table fitted in to the family of other tables inside the database. So it's much easier to use the facilities inside Sage CRM to be able to manage that. Now, let's assume that we are going to create a new table. One of the concepts that we must think about is the concept of screen flow. Screen flow is going to get us to think about all the possible pages and therefore ASP pages that we would need to construct when we think about the navigation. So just as we look here, you can see that in this demonstration, started out looking at the information of opportunities associated with a particular user, flowing into thinking about a particular company, starting to create another opportunity here in the context of the company. Once that's created, we go on to a screen which is from the new screen, we flow back into into a summary screen, and from a summary screen we could flow back to look at the idea of a list screen that is associated with this particular opportunity, or go back to navigate back to the parental object as well. So screen flow is this idea that we can't just think in terms of, oh, I'm going to write a page to do something. It has to fit in to all of the other navigational points inside Sage CRM. Now, the ASP API manages most of these for us in terms of the building in the navigation bars, etc. But we still have to think about this, and this is something that we're starting to introduce now, but we will develop this idea into the next lesson, especially when we're thinking about what happens when we add a record or when we delete a record, what happens. If I move on to this next slide, this is showing you an example of page flow in a fairly static way, ironically, that I'm talking about page flow with a static diagram. But imagine that you've got both the main menu and the My CRM menu. You've created a new entity called project. From the My CRM menu, you might see a project list screen. From the main menu, you might want to be able to find the existing projects, or you may want to create a new project. So if you just focus on that central column at the moment, creating a new page, that new action might have a very simple one-panel entry screen that we need to add the data to, that automatically is served to us in edit mode, so allowing the page to appear to us as though we were writing straight into the fields. We then have to hit the save button, and it will then save the data and return the page to perhaps a different page that is in summary mode. So it is no longer on the edit page designed for insertion of data, but is now on a page that is echoing the data out, perhaps ready for editing or use of workflow. If we wanted to imagine that associated with a user, we can imagine that we also then need for the user to be able to look at the projects that are associated with them. So there would be a list page needed to be added into the context of wherever it was needed. So it's certainly in the My CRM area. But if this project had been created for a company or for a person, then other lists would need to be created underneath those contexts. You can reuse an ASP page in multiple contexts, but you have to think about how you grab the context that you need. When we think about the find pages looking for information, we need to be able to understand how a page is built as a multiple entity or multiple component page. These are complex pages consisting of a box allowing for the entry of data that will then filter the grid beneath it. So you have a search box and a result panel, and they have to be constructed inside the ASP pages. And ASP pages do allow for that to happen. This is complex pages. If we like the idea that you can have a search page, well, you can actually take that concept of searching and apply it into the context of a list that has already been filtered in a particular context. So perhaps a user may have assigned to them 20 different projects, but they need to be able to filter by the delivery dates, the nature of the project, the product being used in the project, for example, and need to have a filter box. And that project list then starts to become, again, a little bit more complex with additional interface elements needing to be included and invoked inside the ASP page. Not terribly difficult, but let's start to see how all of this fits together. So all of those pages start to give you a sense that if you were to add a new entity into Sage CRM, this would not be, to paraphrase the words of a colleague, it wouldn't be a weekend job. It may actually be a much larger job to think about all of the different things that you need to do, including captions and translations to support the interface elements that we're adding into the system. Got to think about as well the naming standards that you would adopt as you do these different jobs. What are if this is a new entity that exists and is associated with other entities, how do you relate them? What are the foreign key references that need to be added elsewhere inside the system? So this is representing all the complexity that might need to be created. There is, of course, going to be an easy answer, because Sage CRM always tries to provide an easy answer. That in this particular context, if it's a brand new primary entity, then you can use the advanced customization wizard to create a new entity that has all of these different elements and has a consistent naming style for all of the objects as well. So the advanced customization wizard is something that you can find inside the community. This is community.sage.com. It's a downloadable download, but actually the community hub.sage.com will have articles that point to the advanced customization wizard. It's used for the creation of primary entities, so those are entities governed by security. And you can also see how you would go and ask how the advanced customization wizard is used by getting the advice of Sage CRM Ally as well. Now, if we develop that idea of the wizard, I mentioned that it will create pages in a consistent way, and it will create them and organize the pages for a new entity, not only creating the metadata, but the supporting ASP pages themselves. It will create them in a nice, tidy subfolder. We'll look at these in the next lesson in a little bit more detail. But it just gives you a sense of the scope of the things you have to think about when you are creating a new structure inside CRM. It can't just be a page, it has to fit in with everything else. Excuse me. And you have to handle the different typical tasks. Now if you like, I'm looking at what we've done. We've done 45 minutes of introduction, and now I'm coming on to the meat of the training, in the sense that the next few slides are going to start looking at how we use all of the information I've said about the way in which the COM API grabs the metadata to assemble the pages that we are interested in creating. So we're going to be looking at how a list page is created, an insert page or an add page is created, an edit page, handling deletes, and creating a search page. Just for this, I'll look at the idea of two before we wrap up today. So the first type of page that we'll look at is a list page structure. Now, the reason why I'm just giving you the bold lines that we have here is that everything else is something of the wrap-up of the page, and you will see descriptions of this inside the documentation, examples inside the references, and inside the blog articles on Community Hub for Sage CRM. But let's look at what's going on here. Sage CRM relies on metadata to do the heavy lifting. Where you see it saying crm.get block opportunity list, it's looking and reading directly into the metadata tables at an object called opportunity list. It knows to read it knows how to read these what's called the custom_screen objects metadata table that will know it is a list, will grab the columns associated with that list and pull them directly into this JavaScript object, which is now my block. I then can use crm.getContextInfo to establish the context. Now, we've met crm.getContextInfo when we looked at the create scripts and table level scripts and validate scripts. It's working out where we are. So the where we are is provided here, and that allows us to find very rapidly the primary key for the entity in context. In this particular case that I'm interested in the company primary key. I then can build an argument string that will limit the data to be returned. And so this argument string, this arg, is going to be equal to the foreign key value of oppo underscore primary company ID being equal to the current company in context. Now, one of the interesting things about Sage CRM in the COM API is that it knows that it's got to render out a Sage CRM page. So it knows it's got to build the top content area. It knows it has to build in the navigational area. And so when we now say crm.add content, that is basically saying, well, I know what I've got. Do you want to add a little bit more of your own? And the myblock.execute method here is being passed the argument string that will be used to restrict the data returned by the execution. Now, the execute method here is the fundamental method for the block. It's going to return the HTML that needs to be included inside the content of the page. Basically, the execute method of a block is going away and saying, go do the voodoo that you do so well. So it's basically saying, I know you know how to fetch data. Go and fetch this data with this restriction and build for me the HTML I need to present the columns inside the page. I then can once the add content is done, I can then invoke the page with the crm.getPage method. Now that does have an override. We can pass into that a changed tab bar if we wanted to, and there are other changes that we can do to add emphasis into a particular tab within the tab bar. But get page will then, in the context of the response.write, return all of the entirety of the HTML that the response has to provide. So that's the result of the HTTP request response cycle. The first information that we were looking at all the way back at the when we talked about the job of the include, that's this. The CRM NoLag has established all of the basic Saturday morning questions of who you are and are you allowed to be there. And what we've done here then is now use those to be able to establish the page. So our list page doesn't need to worry about getting any of the are you allowed to use this page, because the include has already done that for us. By the way, because it knows the session ID, it's automatically not going to allow a user to access data that they shouldn't be able to see. All these blocks restrict the data according to the security policies of CRM. If you think back to some of the conversations I've had elsewhere earlier on, there are other methods that you can use to have unrestricted access to information, and some of the blog articles talk about that as well. But let's assume that we've got a list page that was returned back. That list page within the interface would then have a hyperlink that we want to follow. The hyperlink can point to an ASP page, in the same way as it can point to another CRM internal screen. But if we go on to an edit page, this is what an edit page looks like. An edit page needs to understand when it's moved into mode, how do I allow us to change information here? Now, this is where we need to start to think what's going on. How do we know that this page is supposed to be an edit page? And there is a clever bit associated with edit pages, and that's to do with the internal buttons that automatically appear. So if, for example, let's look at what's happening here. We've got an opportunity detail box, another bit of metadata that is being obtained using CRM get block. So the details are obtained. Now you can see that I'm expecting this to be used in the context of an opportunity. So we're already looking at an opportunity, but for some reason I want to have a specialized block that will allow me to click on this to look at certain fields. This idea might be that we're looking at a set of fields which are not normally shown on the main page. So we click on these fields, click on this tab or option, you look at that, and we next can see that our context is used to restrict the record that is returned. That's my record. So we've got a different method being used here, crm.findRecord. And that can go off and retrieve the record that we're interested in. You can't get a record that you don't have our authorization for. So you could, this would return a no record if the person didn't have the rights to look at that. But then the idea of the record being passed to the screen with the fundamental method of execute being carried out to construct the content being added to the content, which will eventually be written out within the page. So we're building complex pages with only a few lines of code. Now, next week, we're going to develop this considerably. We're going to look through much more detail the way in which a page is constructed, but that's the outline of what we're doing. If you want to read ahead, then do have a look at the community, do have a look at where all the ASP pages are explained, and we're going next time to develop this so that we're looking at the fullness of using our ASP pages for more complex work. So let's see if anyone has any questions. Thank you very much, everyone. I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.